December 15, 1944. The Belgian Ardennes stretched before them like a frozen nightmare, white and silent under the crushing weight of winter. Sergeant Thomas Murphy sat in the loader's position of his M4 Sherman tank, warming his hands over the makeshift heater they'd rigged from spent ammunition casings. Outside, the temperature had dropped below freezing, and inside the tank wasn't much better. The Sherman they called Lucky Penny was part of the 37th Tank Battalion, 3rd Armored Division. She wasn't pretty. Her hull bore the scars of 3 months of combat since Normandy, pockmarked with welded patches where German shells had tested her armor. The crew had nicknamed her after a coin Murphy always kept in his pocket, a copper cent, worn smooth from his father's hand. The old man had carried it through the trenches of the First War. Now it was Murphy's turn. But tonight Murphy wasn't thinking about luck or pennies. He was thinking about the strange contraption strapped to the turret and the mocking laughter that had followed him all day. The improvised communication device had been born from necessity and desperation. 3 days earlier, Lucky Penny's radio had failed during a German artillery barrage near Malmedy. The blast had torn through their communications equipment, leaving them deaf and mute in the middle of a battlefield where coordination meant the difference between life and a fiery end. Without radio contact, they couldn't receive orders, couldn't call for support, couldn't warn other units of enemy movements. Their tank commander, Lieutenant James Callahan, was a mechanical engineer from Detroit before the war. He'd spent his youth in his father's auto shop, learning that solutions came not from pristine parts catalogs, but from looking at what you had and imagining what it could become. When the radio died, Callahan didn't report the tank as non-operational. He went looking for alternatives. In an abandoned farmhouse near their position, he found his answer, or rather, several answers: empty coffee cans, dozens of them remnants of American supplies that had passed through weeks before. The Germans had taken everything of value, but they'd left the cans, seeing no worth in empty tin containers. Callahan saw something different. He saw drums, working through a night thick with the threat of German patrols. Callahan and Murphy had fashioned a communication system that would have made their mothers weep with its childish simplicity. They'd cut the cans, fitted them with improvised strikers made from scrounged metal pieces, and created a series of different-sized drums that produced distinct carrying tones. The idea was simple, almost absurdly so. If they couldn't use radio, they'd use rhythm, different beats for different messages. A steady, slow rhythm meant advance. Rapid staccato beats signaled enemy contact. A rolling thunder of strikes meant retreat or fall back. They'd mounted the coffee cans on the turret, secured with wire and hope, creating a percussion instrument that looked like something children might play with in a schoolyard. And when the other crews saw it at first light, the mockery began. "Murphy's got himself a marching band," laughed Corporal Davis from Iron Horse, parked 30 yards away. "What are you going to do, Tommy? Drum the Germans into submission?" "Maybe he thinks he's back home at a church social," added someone from Hellcat, another Sherman in their platoon. "Gonna drum us up a collection?" Even Lieutenant Briggs, their platoon commander, had shaken his head when he'd inspected it during morning formation. "Callahan, I admire ingenuity, but this is a war zone, not a jazz club. When we get back to Supply Depot, I'm putting you in for a proper radio replacement." "With respect, sir," Callahan had replied, his breath fogging in the cold morning air. "That could be 3 days, maybe a week. We're operational now." "Operational," Briggs had repeated, the word hanging between them like a question. That's one way to describe it. The laughter had followed Murphy throughout the day. Every time he climbed in or out of Lucky Penny, someone had a joke ready. The coffee can drummer, Tommy Tin Can, the Salvation Army tanker, playing for donations. It stung worse than Murphy wanted to admit. He'd been in combat since Omaha Beach, had seen friends torn apart by German 88s, had pulled wounded men from burning Shermans while ammunition cooked off around him. He didn't need to prove his courage, but somehow the ridicule still cut deep. As darkness fell on December 15th, the laughter seemed very far away. Intelligence had reported German movement to the east, but the reports were confused, contradictory. Some said it was just a local counterattack. Others whispered about something bigger, though no one wanted to believe it. The Allies were advancing. The war was nearly won. The Germans were finished, weren't they? In the small Belgian village of Kriekelt, where the 37th Battalion had established their night position, Lieutenant Briggs called his tank commanders together for the evening briefing. Murphy watched from Lucky Penny's hull as Callahan trudged through ankle-deep snow to join the circle of officers gathered around Briggs' jeep. "Gentlemen, Briggs began, his voice low and serious in a way that made Murphy's stomach tighten. "We've received new intelligence within the hour. The situation to our east has become fluid. Very fluid. Fluid. That was Army speak for, we have no idea what's happening, but it's probably bad. We're being reassigned," Briggs continued. "Effective immediately, we're to move to a crossroads approximately 8 clicks southeast of here. Map designates it as Junction 44. It's nothing special, just where a local farm road meets the main supply route to Malm Edy. But Command considers it strategically important. If German armor breaks through further east, this junction could be a key avenue of advance." Murphy felt a chill that had nothing to do with the December cold. Malm Edy. That was where the rumors were ugliest, where intelligence suggested concentrated German forces might be gathering. "Our orders," Briggs went on, "are to establish a defensive position and hold that junction. We're to remain in communication with Battalion HQ and report any enemy movement immediately. The 99th Infantry Division is spread thin in this sector, and we may be the only armor for miles." One of the other tank commanders spoke up, Lieutenant Patterson from Devil Dog. "What's our expected support, sir?" Briggs was quiet for a moment. Too quiet. "At present, minimal. The bulk of our battalion is being held in reserve for a counterattack if needed elsewhere. We'll have our platoon 4 tanks and approximately 20 infantry from the 394th Regiment who will dig in around our position. If things heat up, air support may be available, weather permitting." Weather permitting. Murphy looked up at the sky, heavy with clouds that promised more snow. Weather wouldn't permit anything. They'd be on their own. "We move in 1 hour," Briggs concluded. "Get your men ready." 50 minutes later, Lucky Penny's engine rumbled to life, belching exhaust into the frozen air. The Ford GAA V8 engine, all 450 horsepower of American industrial muscle, sounded strong despite months of hard use. Murphy took his position in the loader's spot, surrounded by the shells that might keep them alive if the night turned ugly. 75mm rounds, each one capable of punching through German armor if you were lucky enough to get the first shot. Next to him, Private Eddie Kowalski, their gunner, was running through his mental checklist, hands moving over familiar controls in the darkness. Eddie was 19 from Chicago and could put 3 rounds on target in the time it took most gunners to fire 2. He was good, maybe the best Murphy had ever seen, but good only mattered if you had the range and the angle. In the driver's position, Corporal Jake Harrison whistled softly between his teeth, a nervous habit he'd developed since Normandy. Jake was from Tennessee, spoke with a drawl that reminded Murphy of honey poured over gravel, and could coax this Sherman through mud, over rubble, and across obstacles that would have stopped lesser drivers. He'd gotten them out of more tight spots than Murphy could count. And in the commander's position, standing in the turret with his head and shoulders exposed to the bitter cold, was Lieutenant Callahan, 32 years old, married with 2 kids he carried photos of in his jacket pocket. Callahan had turned down a rear echelon position to stay with his crew. "I started this with you boys," he'd said. "I'll finish it with you." The column moved out, 4 Shermans in staggered formation, headlights off, navigating by moonlight and memory through the Belgian countryside. The infantry followed in 2 half-track personnel carriers, their faces pale shadows in the darkness. They reached Junction 44 just after midnight. It wasn't much to look at. A simple crossroads where a narrow dirt track, frozen solid by winter, intersected with a wider paved road that ran northeast toward the German lines. An abandoned stone farmhouse stood on the northwest corner, its roof partially collapsed from artillery fire weeks or months before. A grove of pine trees provided some concealment on the eastern approach. Open fields stretched away in every other direction, offering clear fields of fire but precious little cover. Lieutenant Briggs positioned the tanks to cover the 4 approaches to the junction. Iron Horse and Devil Dog took positions covering the northern and western roads. Hellcat covered the southern approach, and Lucky Penny, the tank with the mocked coffee can communication system, was placed to watch the eastern road, the one that led most directly toward the German positions. It was the most exposed position, the one most likely to see contact first. "Callahan," Briggs said as the tanks took their positions, "you'll be our early warning. If anything comes up that road, you alert the rest of us immediately. Think your drums can handle that?" There was no mockery in Briggs's voice now, but the implication stung nonetheless. Callahan simply nodded. "We'll manage, sir." The infantry dug foxholes in the frozen ground, their entrenching tools ringing against earth that resisted their efforts. Someone managed to get a fire started in the ruined farmhouse. More for morale than warmth. Sentries were posted, the tanks buttoned up against the cold, and they waited. Murphy dozed fitfully in his position, the loader's seat offering no comfort, but at least providing some shelter from the wind that howled through gaps in the tank's armor. Around him, the Sherman ticked and creaked as metal contracted in the cold. Every sound seemed magnified in the darkness. Every snap of a branch outside made him jerk awake, hand moving instinctively to the nearest shell. At 0300 hours, Callahan's voice came down from the commander's position. Quiet but urgent. Movement on the eastern road. Can't make out details. Might be our own people. Might be Germans. Stay sharp. Murphy was instantly awake, all traces of sleep burned away by adrenaline. He heard Jake in the driver's seat shift position, ready to start the engine at a moment's notice. Heard Eddie traverse the turret slightly, the mechanical whine of the motor barely audible. 30 seconds passed. A minute. 2 minutes. Then Callahan again. Correction, multiple vehicles. Moving slow. No headlights. This isn't friendly. Murphy's heart hammered in his chest. How many, sir? Can't tell yet, but it's more than a few. They waited in the darkness, every sense straining. Murphy could hear his own breathing, too loud in the confines of the tank, could smell the oil and metal and the faint scent of exhaust that never quite left the crew compartment, could taste copper on his tongue, fear or anticipation, he couldn't tell which. Then they heard it, the sound that tankers feared more than any other, the deep, throaty rumble of diesel engines. Heavy diesel engines, German engines. Armor, Callahan breathed. Jake, warm her up. Eddie, target the road 500 yards. Tommy, load armor piercing. Murphy's hands moved with practiced efficiency, selected an AP round, broke open the breech, slid the shell home, closed the breech. AP loaded! Lucky Penny's engine roared to life, shattering the silence. If the Germans hadn't known they were there before, they knew now. Sir, should I alert the others? Murphy asked, thinking of their radio situation. Callahan was quiet for 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Then, the drums, Tommy. Use the drums. Murphy hesitated for only a moment. Then he grabbed the improvised striker they'd fashioned, climbed up to the turret where the coffee cans were mounted, and began beating out the pattern they'd rehearsed. Enemy contact, enemy contact, enemy contact. The sound rang out across the frozen landscape, a staccato rhythm that carried in the still air. For a moment, nothing happened. Then Murphy heard engines starting from the other tank positions, heard shouted voices as infantry scrambled from their foxholes. The coffee can drums had worked, but there was no time to celebrate. The German column was closer now, perhaps 400 yards out. In the pale moonlight filtering through clouds, Murphy could make out shapes, dark, angular silhouettes that could only be one thing: panzers. Target acquired, Eddie said, his voice steady. Despite the tension, Murphy could hear thrumming through it. Panzer Mark IV, lead vehicle. Range? Callahan asked. 400 yards in closing. Wait for my command. 350 yards. The German tank was huge in Eddie's sights now. Its long 75mm gun pointed straight toward their position. Behind it, Murphy could see more shapes, more tanks. How many? 5? 10? More? 300 yards. Fire, Callahan commanded. Eddie squeezed the trigger. The Sherman bucked as the 75mm gun spoke, the muzzle flash illuminating the darkness like lightning. The recoil hammered through the tank's frame. The smell of cordite filled the crew compartment. Murphy had the breech open before the shell had even finished its flight, had another round selected, had it loaded, and the breech closed in less than 4 seconds. In the distance, sparks flew off the Panzer's front armor. A hit, but not a penetration. The German tank kept coming. Adjust fire. 2 degrees left. Target the glacis joint, Callahan shouted. Eddie made the correction. Ready. Fire! The second shot struck home. This time, Murphy saw the flash of penetration, saw the Panzer shudder and slow, but it wasn't enough. The German tank's gun swiveled, finding them. Reverse! Callahan screamed. Jake, back us up! Jake threw Lucky Penny into reverse, the transmission grinding as 33 tons of American steel surged backward. They'd barely moved 10 yards when the Panzer fired. The German shell passed through the space where Lucky Penny had been moments before, close enough that Murphy felt the pressure wave through the tank's armor. It struck the ground 50 yards behind them and detonated, throwing frozen earth into the air. "Forward, get us back in position," Callahan ordered. "Eddie, that Panzer is still moving. Finish it!" But before Eddie could fire again, another Sherman beat them to it. Iron Horse, Lieutenant Patterson's tank, had moved up and caught the wounded Panzer from the flank. Its shell punched through the German tank's side armor where it was thinner, where the angle gave them advantage. The Panzer exploded, turret lifting off its hull in a gout of flame. One down. But the rest of the German column wasn't stopping. Multiple targets, someone was shouting. Murphy wasn't sure who. More German tanks emerged from the tree line, not just Mark IVs now. Murphy's blood turned to ice as he recognized the shape that every Allied tanker had been trained to fear. A Panther, then another. The German medium tanks, with their sloped armor and powerful 75mm guns, were death incarnate to Shermans. "We got Panthers!" Callahan shouted into the darkness, warning the other crews. Then to Murphy, "The drums! Alert command! We need support!" Murphy scrambled back to the drums, his hands shaking from adrenaline or fear or cold, maybe all three. He beat out the pattern they'd established. Heavy enemy armor, request immediate support. The sound carried across the battlefield, a desperate rhythm in the night. Behind him, Lucky Penny's gun fired again and again. Eddie was in his rhythm now, that place where training and instinct merged. Load, aim, fire, load, aim, fire. A Panther went up, hit by a lucky shot from Devil Dog that found a weak point in its side armor. But more were coming. So many more. The battle became chaos. Muzzle flashes lit the darkness like a thunderstorm. Tracer rounds from machine guns arced across the fields. The sound of tank guns firing, shells hitting armor, explosions, shouted orders, screamed warnings, all merged into a continuous roar that felt like it would never end. Murphy loaded shells until his arms ached, until his hands were raw, until the pile of spent brass casings at his feet was knee-deep. He didn't count the shots, couldn't count them. There was only the next shell, the next load, keeping Eddie's gun fed, keeping them alive for one more second. Through the chaos, he heard Callahan on the intercom. "Iron Horse is hit. Iron Horse is burning." Murphy risked a glance through his periscope. Lieutenant Patterson's tank was engulfed in flames, its crew bailing out into the night, silhouettes against the fire. Hellcat pulling back. He's lost his left track. Another Sherman effectively out of the fight. Devil Dog requests permission to fall back. His gun's jammed. 3 of their 4 tanks gone or ineffective within 15 minutes. Only Lucky Penny remained. The mocked tank with its coffee can drums, still in position, still firing. "Command, do you copy?" Callahan was shouting, though there was no one to hear him on their dead radio. "We need support at Junction 44. Heavy armor, at least battalion strength. We can't hold them alone." But they didn't have a radio. They had coffee cans. Murphy made the decision without thinking. He grabbed the striker and began beating out a new pattern, one they hadn't rehearsed, one born of desperation, a continuous rolling thunder, rapid and urgent. The sound of his fear and determination mixed together. He didn't know if anyone would hear it, didn't know if anyone would understand what it meant, but he kept drumming, kept calling out across the frozen Belgian night, even as German shells exploded around them, even as Eddie kept firing, even as Jake maneuvered them from position to position, trying to stay alive. 16 minutes into the engagement, something changed. Murphy felt it before he understood what it was. A vibration through the ground, through the tank's hull. More engines, more armor, but from behind them, from the west. "Callahan!" he shouted. "We got company coming from our 6. There was a moment of pure terror where Murphy thought it was more Germans, thought they'd been outflanked, thought this was the end. Then he heard a sound that made his heart soar. The higher-pitched roar of American engines. The distinctive clatter of Sherman tracks. More tanks were coming. American tanks. Through the turret hatch, Murphy saw them emerge from the darkness like cavalry from an old western. 5 Shermans, 10, 15. A whole company of American armor, converging on Junction 44. Lieutenant Briggs's voice came from somewhere close by, not through a radio but through raw shouting. "Lucky Penny, hold your position. Support is here. We've got your flank." The new arrivals slammed into the German column from the side, catching them in a crossfire. The Panthers that had seemed invincible moments before were now caught between 2 fires, their advantage in frontal armor meaningless when American shells could strike their vulnerable flanks. The battle turned in minutes. The Germans, suddenly outmatched, began to pull back, their engines roaring as they reversed into the darkness. Some didn't make it. Murphy watched a Panther burn, then another, then a Mark IV that had ventured too close to the farmhouse. By 0430 hours, it was over. The German column had withdrawn, leaving behind 8 burning wrecks and an unknown number of damaged vehicles that limped away into the dawn. Lucky Penny sat in her position, engine idling, Callahan still in his turret, watching the eastern road for any sign of a renewed attack. But none came. As the sun rose over the Belgian Ardennes, Murphy climbed out of the tank on shaking legs. His uniform was soaked with sweat despite the freezing temperature. His hands trembled. His ears rang from 2 hours of continuous gunfire. Lieutenant Briggs walked over, his face blackened with soot, his eyes red-rimmed with exhaustion. He looked at Lucky Penny, at the coffee can drum still mounted on her turret, some dented now from near misses. "The support company heard you," he said simply. "They were 3 clicks west, bedding down for the night. They heard the drums, heard the pattern. They said it sounded desperate enough that they mounted up immediately and came at full speed." He paused, looking at Callahan, then at Murphy. "Your coffee can drums saved this position. Saved all of us. The Germans were trying to push armor through to Malmedy, cut off our supply lines. If they'd taken this junction, if they'd gotten through—" He didn't finish the sentence. Didn't need to. Other crews were gathering now, the men from the surviving tanks, the infantry who'd held their foxholes through the night. They looked at Lucky Penny with new eyes, looked at her drums. Corporal Davis from Iron Horse, his face bandaged where he'd been burned escaping his tank, walked up to Murphy. For a moment, he just stood there. Then he extended his hand. "I'm sorry," Davis said, "for the joke, for doubting. You kept drumming even when we couldn't. You called in the cavalry." He managed a weak smile. "Literally." Murphy shook his hand, too tired for words. Over the next 3 days, as the full scope of the German offensive became clear, as reports filtered in of the massive attack all along the Ardennes front, Junction 44 took on new significance. It was one of dozens of small positions that had held, one of countless small battles that together added up to blunting the German spearhead. But Lucky Penny became something more. Word spread about the tank with the coffee can drums, the crew that had improvised when equipment failed, that had held a crossroads against impossible odds. It became the kind of story soldiers told each other, the kind that reminded them why they were fighting, what they were capable of when pushed to the edge. The mockery turned to legend. 2 weeks later, a military reporter attached to 3rd Army heard the story and came to interview the crew. Murphy was uncomfortable with the attention, but Callahan insisted they tell the story properly. "It's not about glory," Callahan told the reporter, his words measured. "It's about making do. It's about refusing to give up when the easy thing would be to say you're not operational, to pull back, to let someone else take the risk. We needed to communicate, so we found a way. The drums were just—" He paused, searching for word. "They were just what we had." The reporter's article ran in stars and stripes under the headline, "Coffee Can Communication Saves Crossroads." It was picked up by papers back home, became one of those small human interest stories that the War Department loved to promote, the kind that showed American ingenuity, American determination. Murphy kept a copy of the article in his jacket pocket, right next to his Lucky Penny. They fought on through the winter, Lucky Penny and her crew. They were at Houffalize when the bulge was finally closed. They crossed into Germany in February. They saw Cologne, saw the Rhine. They fought all the way to the Elbe River, where they met Soviet forces in April of '45. Through it all, the coffee can drums stayed mounted on Lucky Penny's turret. They never needed them again, the radio having been replaced at the first opportunity. But Callahan refused to remove them. "They're part of her now," he said, "part of her story." Faye. On May 8, 1945, when the German forces in Europe finally surrendered, Lucky Penny sat in a field in Czechoslovakia, her engine silent for the first time in weeks. The crew gathered around her, looking at this Sherman tank that had carried them through 11 months of combat, through battles they never thought they'd survive. Murphy ran his hand along her hull, feeling the welded patches, the scars, the evidence of everything she'd endured. His fingers found the coffee cans, dented and rusting now, but still there. "What do you think will happen to her?" Eddie asked. "When we go home? They'll probably scrap her," Jake said. "Melt her down. Use the metal for something else. That's what they do with most of them." "Shame," Callahan said quietly. "She deserves better. She deserves to be remembered," Murphy said. "They all do. Every crew that got in these things knowing they were outgunned, knowing they were outmatched, but doing it anyway because it needed to be done." They stood in silence for for a moment, 5 men who'd shared the most intimate form of combat, who'd lived in a metal box together, who'd depended on each other for survival in a way that civilians could never fully understand. The drums saved us, Eddie said, at the crossroads. When everything else failed, the drums saved us. No, Callahan corrected gently. We saved ourselves. The drums were just a tool. We were the ones who didn't give up, who found a way, who held the line when it mattered. Murphy thought about that, thought about all the tanks like Lucky Penny, all the crews like theirs, all the small stands at small crossroads that together won a war. Nobody was going to build monuments to Junction 44. Nobody was going to remember the names of most of the men who fought there. In 50 years, maybe 100, it would just be history, battles, and dates and casualty figures. But they would remember. The men who were there would carry it with them always. The night they held a crossroads with a Sherman tank that everyone had mocked, with a communication system made from coffee cans, with nothing but their training and their courage and their refusal to quit. 3 months later, Murphy was on a ship heading home, Lucky Penny left behind in Europe, along with millions of other pieces of equipment the Army no longer needed. He stood on the deck, watching the coastline disappear, his Lucky Penny in his hand. He thought about writing down everything that had happened, thought about trying to explain it to people back home, but he knew he couldn't. How do you explain what it felt like to load shells in a burning tank? How do you explain the sound of your friends screaming as their Sherman brewed up? How do you explain the desperate improvisation that had characterized every day of the war? Maybe it was enough that they knew, the men who were there, the men who held the line. Years later, Murphy would sometimes wake in the night, his heart pounding, the phantom sound of tank guns echoing in his memory. In those moments, he would reach for the Lucky Penny on his nightstand, would run his thumb over its worn surface, and would remember. Remember the cold Belgian night. Remember the coffee can drums calling for help across a frozen battlefield. Remember 5 men in a Sherman tank that everyone had mocked, holding a crossroads against impossible odds. Remember that when everything else failed, they found a way. And in the morning, when his wife asked if he'd had the dreams again, Murphy would just nod. Some things he'd learned couldn't be explained to people who weren't there. Some things you carried alone. But on certain quiet nights, when the moon was right and the air was cold, Murphy could still hear it. The rhythm he'd beaten out on coffee cans in the darkness, the sound of desperation and determination mixed together, the sound of men refusing to quit. And in his memory, Lucky Penny still sat at that crossroads, her drums calling across the years, a reminder that courage sometimes came in unexpected forms, that heroes sometimes made do with coffee cans, and hope, that the war was won not just by grand strategies and overwhelming force, but by thousands of small stands at forgotten crossroads, by crews who refused to give up even when they were mocked, even when they were outgunned, even when the smart thing would have been to pull back and let someone else take the risk. They held the line. That was what mattered. They held the line. And somewhere in Europe, rusting in a field or cut up for scrap or perhaps preserved in some forgotten depot, Lucky Penny's coffee can drums still hang on a turret, waiting for someone to remember the night they saved a crossroads, saved a battle, saved lives that would otherwise have been lost. They laughed at the drums until the drums brought salvation, until one Sherman held a crossroads alone, until 5 men in 33 tons of steel proved that courage and ingenuity could overcome mockery and doubt. That was Junction 44. That was December 16th, 1944. That was the night everything changed. And that was the story they carried home, written not in official records or history books, but in the memories of men who were there, who lived it, who would never forget the sound of coffee cans drumming in the darkness, calling for help that came just in time. That was their war. That was their story, and it deserves to be remembered.